Friends, we live in a strange world. One that is greatly defined by fame, going viral, getting as many likes as possible. A world that rewards rash and hostile words with screen time. A world that watches eyes glued to disasters happening across the globe, havoc and chaos ensuing, livelihoods torn apart. Yet more often than not, those who are featured are most often those in power who are battling over ego rather than seeking to make a difference. We live in a world where ego reigns supreme. And even if this is not our personal norm or way of going about the world, we are still immersed in it. So many people define their entire lives by how successful they are, or at least appear to be. It's in the very fabric of our society that those who rise into positions of power earn, if not our respect, at the very least our attention. And we have difficulty looking away. It is enticing wanting to be seen, honored, and glorified. But I don't believe this is an altogether new phenomenon. Throughout time, society's focus has always been on the powerful, those who have the ability to move and sway, those who can make things happen. Our history books are defined by people in power, by what they did well or what they didn't do so well. Leaders throughout time wanted to make their mark and be known for achieving something great, and the people around them wanted to be close to them so that they could raise their own level of importance. Because the closer you are to greatness, the greater that you seem. Power is not an exclusive desire of the wealthy, of those in politics or in the world of business. The institutional church has from the very beginning walked a fine line between living the gospel and seeking power. As we can see from today's text, even religious leaders in Jesus' day were concerned with hierarchy and power. In the text today, we find Jesus at a meal, which was the perfect setting where one could determine one's power, as where you sat at a meal determined your status and your level of honor. In today's passage, Jesus looks around at the table where he is seated. Undoubtedly, he is poised in the position of honor himself as a religious leader. He's been invited to the home of a Pharisee to dine with other religious leaders of the day. And looking around the table, he can tell just by where each person is seated how powerful he may be. While at the meal, he decides to give them a bit of a lesson. He uses a parable of a wedding to demonstrate his point. And I think this is an analogy that we can relate to well. Likely, we've all been to weddings where we've been seated up right at the front. We've either been in the wedding party, we have been family members to the bride and groom, or at least great friends with them. Also, I think many of us have been to weddings where our connection to the couple has been slim at best. And you found yourself placed at the very back of the dining hall, just hoping you would be close to cake or hors d'oeuvres. Unlike the wedding Jesus is describing, many weddings today have assigned seating, so you know your place before you arrive. Yet there's the occasional get-together with no assigned seating, and boy, how awkward is it to be asked to move. That actually happened to me about 2 years ago at what I thought was a good friend's wedding. We arrived a little early to the reception, and I thought we would be really safe if we just sat somewhere in the middle, no one would bother us. And yet it happened to be someone very close to the bride who came up to us and said, I'm sorry, you can't sit there. Could you please move back a couple of tables? It was pretty embarrassing for me and everyone else involved. Beyond the mere fact that in situations like this, anyone could be embarrassed, Jesus, in this particular situation, is making a point that oftentimes it's easy to assume that we belong right up front, as if it's our special day. Yet he tells those he dines with, when you're invited, go and sit at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Humility. What a difficult thing to practice. As I put some thought and research into this passage this week, I recognized how often humility is expressed as a feeling. It's often felt by being humbled by an experience in ways that could be good or bad. A personal example, I was humbled by the experience of my ordination just 2 weeks ago. Humbled to think of all the people who have gone before me in this office. Humbled by the pastoral mentors that I look up to, the women who paved the way for me to even be ordained one day. Incredibly humbled by the weight the term reverend brings. Knowing full well that, like any position of authority or power, there's an incredible responsibility in that title. Aware of both those who have abused that title and those who have worn it with grace. More than anything, it has made me incredibly aware of myself as I figure out who I am in this new role. Humility, in many ways, is nothing if not radical self-awareness. Being aware of who you are and how you function in relation to others and the rest of creation. It is a willingness to see oneself no differently than any other part of God's creation. One of my favorite podcasts is Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And on their episode themed humility, the host Casper recounts a story of him connecting with a Catholic nun. She spoke to him about humility for herself when comparing herself to others. She told him she would always end her personal descriptions of other people with, like me. So when she would think to herself, that person is kind, she would always repeat to herself, like me. That person is jealous, like me. That person is unworthy, like me. That person is holy, like me. Her awareness of her interconnectedness and relationality to others was her ongoing practice of humility. I think in this passage and throughout the gospel accounts, it can be easy to vilify the Pharisees. We can look at this text as if Jesus is roasting them at dinner for not being better religious leaders. But I don't think that's quite what is going on here. Jesus is at a meal with men who are colleagues. True, he set them up for a teachable moment, but these men have dedicated their lives to religious living, teaching, and practice. They're not necessarily disgraced or corrupt, but they are the products of an institution. They're living in a Roman society that dominates over them. So structure, order, religious adherence, these are things that have protected their identity as Jews under an oppressive power. Jesus' reminder to them at this meal is that humility is not a weakness, even if it is seen as such by the powers that be. It's not being someone else's doormat, and it's much more than not being a jerk. It is the ability to see in others their position as a child of God, worthy of love, like you. So when Jesus turns to the host and tells him who he should invite to a banquet, he's essentially telling him, with those whom you would never in your wildest dreams associate with. The poor, the marginalized, the outcast, the people who Jesus is scoffed at for associating with. For it is through these connections that you will encounter what it is to be a part of the realm of God. Perhaps in this moment during the meal, the religious leaders look around and are humbled by what Jesus tells them. That's good. It's a step towards self-reflection and awareness for them. But Jesus is asking them to go further. Through his parables, he's asking them to practice humility. If you seek to be righteous, humble yourself. It's something I ask of my staff at Camp Hyoka and something that I seek to practice, although I do admit at times that even I need knocked down a peg. I'm lucky enough to have friends and colleagues who are honest with me to show me grace and love when I need to be checked. I respect them for doing so even when it hurts a little. Sometimes my job downright reminds me of my humility. There's nothing like an overflowing or clogged toilet at camp to remind you that, yes, even though I'm a newly ordained minister of Word and Sacrament, I still have to go grab a plunger and try to keep this ministry going. I ask nothing less from our summer staff. We don't ask them to do anything that myself or our senior director would not do. This practice of humble righteousness or servant leadership is a model for the youth that we serve. Through our example, we know that not only is God working to transform us, God is working at transforming our campers. When we practice humility, treat each other with respect and dignity, stretch outside of our comfort zones to interact with people we normally wouldn't interact with, we're living and leaning into the realm of God. I say this to you as if it were easy. Easy to be full of grace and love and humility at all times. It may be something we strive for, yet it's something that we will still fall short of. Even the early church failed to figure this out fully. They sought to live in righteous community, be like Jesus, and yet they were still human. Something as simple as a meal, being able to eat together, was particularly difficult in the life of the church. Peter couldn't figure out if it was socially acceptable to eat with Gentiles. The early church at Corinth, they hoarded their communion meal and wouldn't share with those who were poorer than them. Even as our church institutionalized over time, it began fencing the communion table, allowing only those who were seen as worthy. Even as late as the 19th and early 20th century, pastors were visiting parishioners' homes to determine whether or not they were worthy for the annual communion meal. There are many people today who still do not feel comfortable coming to the table if they don't think that they're right with God. Yet what we so often miss about the table is that it is the means by which we encounter the grace, mercy, and love of God. It's our means of coming into a righteous community, seeking God even though we may be unworthy. Coming to the table is our means of experiencing humility as well as practicing it. Today's passage in Luke 14 leads right into Jesus' next parable about the great banquet, one in which all are invited to feast at God's table. This is the first scripture lesson that our campers heard this summer. For many, their first entry into camp, and why I believe so many youth become so deeply attached to our ministry, is because we make it known that all are welcome. All are welcome in this place. All are welcome for exactly who they are as a child of God. And all are welcome to come to the table, be they second graders or seniors in high school, at our final chapel service at the end of each week. As a church, I believe we must constantly be asking ourselves with humility, who are we inviting in? By our actions, who do we believe is worthy of coming into our communities of faith and sitting at Christ's table? Are we at the very least communicating to one another that each of us is welcome and loved in this place? It doesn't even matter where we sit, whether it's in the same pew every week or same chair. We're all of us meant to work and be in relationship and love together, no matter who we are. We are all invited, all of us, to Christ's table for the feast. And it is our ability to give and receive grace from those whom we don't expect that truly humbles us. Now, as a visiting pastor, and this worked pretty well in the first service, I'd like to stretch everyone a bit by asking you to turn to the person next to you or close to you. Look at them and tell them, you are a child of God, like me. Amen.